Hi everyone, welcome to week 6. This week we'll be discussing unsettling colonial structures of family life, in particular settler colonial imaginaries of children and families. So we'll be paying particular attention to past present histories of settler colonialism in Canada and its ongoing project within early childhood education. So in particular, we'll be asking questions about the form and function of the family as a unit of colonial empire and drawing on the readings to unpack what settler colonialism is and what it does. So to do this week, we'll be reading Imagining a Better Future, an Introduction to Teaching and Learning About Settler Colonialism in Canada, and the link to that article is on Moodle. We'll also be reading Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's chapter Imperialism, History, Writing and Theory in her book Decolonizing Methodologies. This book has a research focus, but her arguments are very relevant to education and in particular early childhood education as well. So as you're reading, think of some questions that you might bring to your virtual collaboratory to frame some discussions. By Friday at 11:55 p.m., submit your weekly notes. And by Sunday at 11:55 p.m., respond to 2 other weekly posts. And of course, participate in your group's 1-hour virtual collaboratory and the Google Doc. So to start our conversations this week, I think it's important to ask the question, what is the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism? Colonialism is different from settler colonialism in that settlers did not stay and settle on another's land, but rather it's when this dominant group exploits land, resources, and bodies from afar, so through trade, debt, education, etc. So this difference matters because the ways in which power is exercised and performed are different, and the oppressive effects are also different. So Lorenzo Veracini offers us a helpful and yet very simplified metaphor in conceptualizing this difference. He uses the metaphor of viruses and bacteria as an image of colonialism and settler colonialism. So he writes of colonialism as similar to a virus, in that viruses attach to a host cell and then penetrate it. They do not have, however, their metabolism and require a host cell to replicate. So while both colonizers and settler colonizers are exogenous elements that assert their dominance over their destination and locale, a colonial system of relationships, unlike a settler colonial one, is premised on the presence and subjugation of exploitable others. So in other words, the colonial force aims to exploit and extract, yet does not settle here. It requires the existence of the local peoples to uphold their colonial project. So while in colonialism settlers may come for a short while, they eventually leave and exploit the location from afar and through a different set of rationalities. So Veracini further illustrates settler colonial formations as similar to the formations of bacteria. He writes that settler collectives make and remake places and are also simultaneously transformed by them. So bacteria does not require a living host. He writes, quote, bacteria frequently secrete chemicals into their environment in order to transform it to their benefit. This can facilitate the acquisition of nutrients from the surrounding environment or make movement possible. Similarly, settlers routinely and programmatically set out to reorganize the landscape and deliberately promote processes of systematic environmental transformation. So in this way, you can see the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. So as we began discussing last week, settler colonialism is not something that ended after European settlers arrived on the land of Turtle Island and enforced colonial rule by displacing Turtle Island's indigenous peoples and taking their land. And nor did it end when the last residential school closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. In Canada, settler colonialism forms an ongoing set of rationalities that govern and appropriate the ways in which Canada operates as a state, through institutions, societal structures, and in our minds. Settler colonialism works to attain the management of bodies and subsequently land. So present-day colonialism is often also referred to as neo-colonialism. So it refers to a particular set of values within society that serves the needs of the dominant group. So things like individualism, accumulation, productivity, to further fuel the colonial agenda of conquest and economic expansion. So these values create unequal hierarchies within society and create systems of governmentality, mentalities where human progress is surveilled and maintained through public discourse. By self-surveillance, I mean the practice of self-monitoring our behaviors comparatively against the expectations of dominant group practices. And I'll go into this a little bit further in a few slides. So going back to, I think it was either last week or the week before, where we talked a little bit about discourse. So discourses that circulate through and between individuals and society. So through these social expectations that operate through discourse, they may not be explicitly enforced or outright dictated, but they function through conscious and subconscious workings, where norms are assumed to be given, and through their banality they go unquestioned. So individuals are both subject to and subject of these discourses. We participate in the ongoing formation of these discourses. Often, only if something falls outside the norm of these discourses is when we may notice it and we may pay attention to it. So when thinking about the movement of power via discourse and through self-surveillance, French philosopher Michel Foucault's work is particularly significant to this conversation. Foucault's work is interested in how power is exercised and moved among society and individuals. So Foucault wrote that power, quote, reaches into the very grain of individuals, touches their bodies, and inserts itself in their actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes, and everyday lives, end quote. So in his discussion of the movement of power and social regulation, Foucault uses the metaphor of the panopticon, and this is an image of the panopticon. So it was developed, this model and design was developed in the 18th century as a scheme of design in a prison where all of the inmates were aligned in a way where they could be easily observed by a single watchman in the tower. Yet the prisoners were unable to see the watchman. So this created a sort of internalized coercion through supposed ongoing observation, despite if the watchman was actually watching or not, because the inmates wouldn't be able to see if the watchman was actually watching. So there's this ongoing essence of feeling like you're being watched, but you may not actually be. So Foucault argues that this is the means by which the state is able to govern and regulate individuals via discourse, where particular values create assumed norms of behavior, and individuals perform them by monitoring themselves against others. So power thus moves through the formations of discourses between the state and the individual, and between individuals themselves.